In 18th century England, Viscount Fairfax paid his maid £3 a year. The Viscount also spent £3 a year on green tea. Hi, my name is Bose. I have an MA in Early Modern English History, and today we're going to talk about the shocking truth of servant wages in the 18th century. I would like to start this video by saying that we are not talking about the 19th century today, and I am emphasising this because modern perceptions of domestic service are greatly shaped by the stories we are told by grandparents and parents and popular television programmes about experiences of service in the 19th and 20th centuries. However, experience of domestic service was completely different in the 18th century. In the 18th century, employing domestic servants was not limited to the upper and elite classes, and historians estimate that around 40% of English households employed at least one domestic servant in the 18th century. Servants were seen as a necessity for many households, as these are the times before washing machines, central heating and light switches, and servants did all of these tasks for masters and mistresses. It's also important to note that the majority of households only would have employed one servant. Yes, there are cases such as the Duke of Norfolk, who employed over 30 servants. But for the majority, 1 to 2 servants were employed. While there are a dozen servant positions already forming in the 18th century, today we are going to focus on 3. Today we are going to focus on the wages of 3. The maids, the footmen, and the cooks. However, if you would like to hear more about the range of servant positions in the 18th century and their wages, please let me know with a comment below. There's one last thing I would like to emphasise. Domestic service was not a one-size-fits-all experience in the 18th century. Every single servant would have had a unique experience, and this would have been different from even the other servants in their household. That being said, let's look at some servant wages. The maid servant was the most common type of domestic servant in 18th century England. Many women would have entered domestic service at around the age of 15, usually as a maid of all works, and then would have left around the age of marriage at 24. Many women entered domestic service with the view of saving their wages so that they could later afford a dowry and to set up a household with their husband once they married. There were many types of maids in the 18th century: housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, but most were expected to be flexible in their work. All were female and predominantly young women, and were paid around the same wage. So how much could a maidservant expect to be paid? Sources largely document a wage of around £2 to £3 over the course of the 18th century, but this does fluctuate, and there are cases where maids were paid less than £1 a year. However, there are also cases where maids were paid over £4 a year, but these were largely in the large country estates, usually owned by the aristocratic, and I would like to emphasise that these jobs were more the exception with these high wages for maids than the standard practice, and maids working in these houses were probably more experienced and highly skilled. To contextualise these wages a little bit, we will go to Yorkshire in the 18th century, where Heaton employed 1 to 2 maids a year, and these maids would spend about a third of their yearly wage on a gown. I would like to say that clothing was relatively expensive in the 18th century because fabric had to be handmade as well as for clothes. So to contextualise this a little bit further, also in Yorkshire, in 1751 at her death, Dorothy Lawton's 11 sheep were valued at £2 exactly. Now we will move on to perhaps the most recognisable and one of the most common male servant positions from a modern perspective: the footman. By the 18th century, the employment of male servants in a household had become a real status symbol. This was because male servants were so much more expensive to employ than female servants. This was largely due to the much higher wages a male servant commanded, and the tax implemented by Parliament on the male servant employment. This led to almost 80% of servants in 18th century London being female. Male servants were saved for the most visible position in the household: footmen, butlers, and stewards. It was also not unheard of for a smaller household to drag a farm labourer out of the fields for the day to become a footman when important guests were visiting a household. As a consequence, maids were seen as a necessity by many of the aspirational middling sort, but footmen were seen as a luxury. So how much were footmen actually paid? Footmen earned around £8 a year, although this could be as high as £12 in some of the wealthier households. Keeping with our examples of Yorkshire, as a contextualisation example, a cottage in rural Yorkshire could cost about £10, and footmen earned around 2 to 3 times the amount of the average female maid. Moving on to our last servant of the day, we will be looking at the cook. Cooks were employed in the wealthier households in England in the 18th century, and were a very distinct servant position, as it was the only position that could be filled by either a man or a woman. The fashion in England, of course, was to employ a male cook, preferably one who was trained in France, and this was considered the height of luxury. Male cooks with such training could demand high wages, which frequently exceeded £20, which could have bought a reasonably large house in rural Yorkshire at the start of the 18th century. However, very few families could afford such a luxury, and it was much more common to find a female cook in houses. Female cooks were to expect a salary between £3 and £11 over the course of the 18th century. However, it is important to note that some female cooks received less than this, and Nicholas Blundell only paid his female cook £2 a year. Wage would have been largely impacted by a cook's skills and experience, and in fact the best endorsement for a female cook's skills was to be able to say that she had trained underneath a male cook. Wages were not the only compensation that servants received in the 18th century. There were many little perks, but the main cost to employers of employing servants was the bed and board they had to provide. Now don't get me wrong, servant sleeping conditions in the 18th century were not nice. The idea of separate sleeping quarters for servants was in its infancy, and only available in the grandest new-built houses out in the country, and many maids were forced to sleep on kitchen floors or shelves. Meanwhile, it was common practice in towns to have footmen sleep in front of doorways to act as burglar alarms in case somebody broke in. Contemporary employers frequently bemoaned the cost of feeding servants, and it shouldn't be underestimated how big an attraction having all your food paid for would have been for many people who experienced food uncertainty in the 18th century. So that was a brief look into the wages of 3 different servant types in the 18th century. If you want to learn some more really random historical facts, make sure you check out my channel and come back next week for some more really random history. That's all for now. Bye!